Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. I don't know where to start today. I've rewritten this introduction at least 3 times. This past week, we have seen a council member in Mill Creek comparing COVID-19 restrictions to the Holocaust. We have all become witness to the horrific murder of George Floyd by a white police officer. We've seen peaceful protests turn to looting and violence in our city as rage and frustration boil over. And through it all, our vulnerable population remains isolated in their homes, missing hugs from their children and grandchildren and milestone celebrations. My heart aches in despair, and I'm full of frustration and anger at the injustices, the prejudice, the fear, and so much suffering on so many levels. But overall, I feel angry. Angry at systems that aren't broken because they were built on injustice. Systems that don't need fixing because they need to be completely rebuilt. There are no easy answers. We have to dig in our heels, and even in those moments, and there are so many, when it seems impossible that we can change it, or it seems too big and overwhelming, and we ask ourselves, but I'm just one person, what can I do? We have to keep trying. Elie Wiesel wrote, "We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim." There are many lessons we can learn from the Holocaust, but one that stands out to me is that we cannot be bystanders. There's no excuse for doing nothing. There's a list on the Holocaust Center's website of things you can do to confront racism, but I'm going to give you one more. Stop spreading misinformation. Did you read that entire article before you shared it? Do you know where the information came from? Fake news stories play on our emotions. They often breed hate, mistrust, and generally aim to distract us or lay blame. We know that even the most skeptical, educated, and critical media consumer can fall prey to media that aims to sway our thinking. In the context of the Holocaust, we call this propaganda. Today, we call it fake news. A recent study from Psychological Science showed that people are more likely to believe a fake article when they have seen it multiple times, and consequently, they are more likely to share it with others. For those of us who are familiar with Holocaust history, this is not surprising, nor is this a new idea. The only part of it that's new is the ease and speed with which we can share news widely. The platform is different, but people are the same. With us today, with tips on how to be reliably informed, is John Silva, Director of Education at the News Literacy Project. The News Literacy Project is a national education nonprofit offering nonpartisan, independent programs that teach students how to know what to trust in the digital age. Holocaust Center for Humanity Museum docents and educators, Marcy and Carl Shutoff, will take a deep dive into a few examples of propaganda during the Holocaust that are part of the Holocaust Center for Humanities collection. Our panelists will answer questions at the end of the program. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions at any time. We will address as many as we can at the end of the program. Thank you all again for joining us today for this important program. We couldn't offer programs like this one without our supporters. If you are able, please consider making a donation on our website, holocaustcenterseattle.org. Just click on the donate link in the top right corner of the homepage. Thank you for your support. John Silva, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll pass it over to you.
Hi, thank you so much, Alana. I am really happy to be joining everyone today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk about this really critically important topic. I'm going to be talking for a few minutes about what we say is how to be news literate. And the short version of how we talk about that is about being reliably informed so that you know what's going on from reliable sources of information. As Alana mentioned, my name is John Silva. I'm part of the education team at the News Literacy Project, a national nonpartisan nonprofit organization. I've been with the News Literacy Project for a little over 3 years. Prior to that, I was a classroom teacher here in Chicago with Chicago Public Schools. And I am very excited with the work that we're doing. It's an incredibly busy but incredibly important work. And I'm glad that I have a chance to share some ideas with you about what it means to be reliably informed, but also to talk about some skills that you'll need to learn how to verify information and help stop the spread of misinformation. So I'm just going to start by talking about what do I mean when we say news literacy. So news literacy effectively is really being reliably informed. It's about understanding what makes something credible or not credible, about prioritizing your information from sources of information that follow the standards of quality journalism, verified information from reputable news organizations and journalists. But it's also about interacting with the news and the journalists and really finding ways to talk about what's really going on in the world from a place of being informed. And with that being reliably informed, it's really about also engaging in civic life in an empowered, informed way. And so I want to talk a little bit about the scope of the problem that we're dealing with, not just today and in the last week, but in really many of the recent years. I'm going to show you some examples of different types of misinformation. Here's an example from Twitter that went viral back in April. So this is a false rumor that was spread on Twitter claiming that the Trump International Hotel in Las Vegas was the only one that had not donated food or supplies for emergency personnel in Las Vegas. It's completely not true, but it was made up as a rumor and as a type of political propaganda to feed into a particular political viewpoint. This example from Instagram is very common, a type of claim with the political viewpoints surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic as well. These big, broad, very strong political claims that don't really put forward any, really important information, but it's really about stoking people's strong emotions. Conspiracy theories are also rampant on social media. They continue to grow in a lot of really disturbing ways. This one is a common theme from the COVID-19 pandemic about the relationship between whether or not COVID-19 was a manufactured virus, it's a bioweapon, and it feeds into some of the anti-vaccine conspiracy theories and propaganda that you see. Likewise, this is a type of misinformation from a anti-vaccine account on TikTok, and I'm just going to show it to you very, very briefly.
Here we go. Hey, to the right, to the left, to the right, to the right, to the left, to the left, to the left, to the left. Now walk it by yourself. Now walk it by yourself.
So one of the things about this account is that this person is claiming to be a doctor. You can see that she's wearing a stethoscope in the example, and she has the "I'm a doctor too" on here. And showing this is one of those examples that a lot of people don't think of TikTok as being a source of misinformation and propaganda and conspiracy theories. But the reality is that we shouldn't focus on any one particular platform. Often when we are talking about news literacy and misinformation, we tend to focus on Facebook and Twitter. But when we're talking about being reliably informed, it's important to remember that it's really about the skills that we use to verify information. It's not about the platform. So we shouldn't just focus on one platform or another. The problem really is that you can find misinformation on any social media platform or in group messaging apps. And what we focus on at the News Literacy Project is teaching people that you can learn how to filter out misinformation and verify things to be reliably informed. And so I'm going to show you this just to sort of think about this for yourselves for a minute. If one of these came across one of your social media feeds and you decided to search for it, what do you suppose that you would find? Would you find reputable news articles talking about these, or are you likely to find more information that's amplifying and deepening some of these conspiratorial beliefs and some of these blatant types of misinformation and propaganda? And so news literacy is really about what you do when you are trying to verify information before you share it. So I'm going to talk about some skills that you can use to think about how you engage with information on your social media feeds. One of the most important things that we always have to remember is that misinformation is all about our emotional responses. And we need to really think clearly about why we're having an emotional response to something. So this example here is a common type of political propaganda you might see, political misinformation, because misinformation is manipulating our emotions. And the way it does that is that when we have a strong emotional reaction to something, that part of our brain is front and center. And the rational centers of our brains sort of take a break for a few minutes. And so in that emotional response, we're not really thinking about what we're seeing, we're just reacting to it. And it's in that emotional response that we often will like or share or retweet something before we've even really had a chance to evaluate it. And it's an important thing to remember that when I talk to educators about this, adolescents in particular are very vulnerable to misinformation because their brains are still developing. The human brain isn't fully developed with all the rational centers of the brain until about the mid-20s. Likewise, when we talk about older people, when we start to talk about how the brain starts to decline in later years, it's almost a reverse of how the brain develops. And so older people can be very vulnerable to misinformation for the same reason. But also we tend to be more vulnerable to misinformation because we're also very set in some of our political and social beliefs. When something triggers an emotional response and it's something that we believe in very strongly, we're also likely to respond to it before we really had a chance to think about. I'm going to show you this example. This example popped up on social media yesterday afternoon. You may have seen it in response to the president visiting St. John's Church in Washington, D.C. This is a type of political misinformation and propaganda that will elicit just a visceral reaction, right? Using Nazi imagery is very powerful, and it triggers deeply held emotional responses and beliefs. But if you look closely, if you take a second and you look really closely, you can see that it's actually a really poor Photoshop job. You can see the shape of the hand and the thumb. Someone just basically copied and pasted from one onto the other. And this image is still being shared widely on social media as if it's true, but it's not. It's a very poor Photoshop job. And just for context, here's the actually original image that it was taken from. So thinking about our emotional responses before we engage in something, we need to really think about how we're going to verify information before we share it. And why do people share things like this, right? So why are they trying to manipulate us? So sometimes when we talk about hoaxes, are designed to get money from us. Sometimes they're scams. Sometimes people are doing it just because they're trying to get a reaction from someone. But more and more, a lot of what we see across our social media feeds are very political. They are designed to further a particular political viewpoint or damage another. And in a lot of ways, we've seen in the last several years that this misinformation epidemic is really dividing us in ways that we haven't been divided in a very long time. And it's really starting to undermine the foundation of our democracy. And so this is one of the reasons why recognizing misinformation is so critically important, especially this year as we're in an election year and things, emotions are running so much higher, especially in the last week. So it's really important to think about your emotional responses. Another key skill that is something that we really need to spend a lot of time thinking about is the difference between news and opinion. When we're looking at, especially if we talk about network news, so much of the content that we see on these news networks is skewed very heavily towards analysis and opinion. And there is news out there, but the transitions between them are often very subtle. And so if we're talking about being reliably informed, we need to prioritize news. So news is all about informing us. It's about telling us what has been verified by journalists from multiple quality sources. They're trying to tell us the who, the what, the where, and the when. Opinion pieces are really about trying to persuade us to further a particular viewpoint, and it's about why we should believe something or not. And so this is an important thing. If we're trying to focus on being informed, like we want to know what's going on, we have to prioritize news. One of the tools that we have at the News Literacy Project is an app called Informable. I'll share a link towards the end here in a moment, but it's really about sort of talking about some of the differences. So you can see in this example, it says from the editorial board, the account is from Post Opinions. This is an example of an opinion piece. This story here is more about talking about facts. So this is a Wall Street Journal. It says it's a Wall Street Journal analysis, but it's really telling us, they're breaking down about a report. They're talking about what's going on with the story. And so the way we want to prioritize news is by looking for journalism that follows the standards of quality journalism. Information has been verified. They tell us who their sources are. Information is fair. It's showing all the sides and all the information from all different aspects of the story. They're providing context so we can fully understand what the story is about. And reputable news organizations are accountable for what they put out. If they make a mistake, they correct it. Corrections are a sign of a quality news organization. And they're transparent about things. So for example, the Washington Post, if they do a story on Amazon, they should in that story remind people that the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon. So these are some of the key things that we try to teach to look for reputable sources of news. Another really important thing that we want to think about is when we see something and it's making a claim, is there actually evidence to support that claim? So here, this post you might see claiming that molecule is just is very similar to plastic and margarine are almost identical. And so when you see this, you might feel a little shocked by it. But if you really take a look at it, you see that there's really no evidence to support what it's claiming. Whereas this from the Pew Research Center, not only are they giving us this graph that explains a bit about what was going on with this study, there's a link that we can click on to learn more about how they got this. So comparing them side by side, you can see some of the differences, but it's part of us being critical about what we're seeing. This is an example recently from the COVID-19 pandemic. People are filming their hospitals, showing nothing going on outside, and claiming that this is evidence that the COVID-19 pandemic is just overblown. So some questions that we can ask ourselves as we're evaluating these things is asking about the source of the claim and the credibility, looking at the evidence. If the source passes a credibility test, is the source of the evidence, and is that evidence credible, and does it actually support what it's claiming? These questions were adapted from the Stanford History Education Group's Civic Online Reasoning curriculum. They've done a lot of great research in this. A couple of key fact-checking skills that we want to talk about very quickly. Some things that you can do. So one is just observation. You may have seen this image go viral recently back in April. This is not a real image. This woman was not holding that sign. It was photoshopped. But if you take a close look and you look a little closer, you can see that there is some distortion in her hand where the sign was altered. Those fingers are curved at an unnatural angle and the O is not quite clear. We want to really look closely at things, especially t-shirts and signs. If we see images like this that we want to check out further, we can do what's called a reverse image search. So this is basically a very specialized type of a search engine that takes an image that you find online and tries to match the pixel patterns with images in the search database. Google Images, TinEye, and another service called Yandex are three of the top reverse image searches that you can use. So a simple way to do this is if you see an image in your social media feed, if you right-click in your browser, there's a middle menu that pops up that says search Google for image. And that's going to pop up some search results. You want to go through them very carefully. Some of the first ones that pop up here are fact checks that relate to the image. But if you scroll down a little further, you can actually see that these aren't fact checks. These are sites that are just amplifying and spreading the original misinformation. A third that you can do is called lateral reading. So if you see something like this, it's a way of doing an effective search. So we want to learn how to effectively search for something and really evaluate the results. So we want to look at a Google search. We can put something in quotation marks. There's a number of ways of doing this. But the idea is that we want to search for more information and keep searching until we're confident. Again, this is other research from the Stanford Graduate School of Education and the Stanford History Education Group. They've done a lot of great work on this. So using that same sign, we can simply type in the details of the sign, and we can see in the results, again, we have fact checks that pop up. So those are three fairly straightforward tools that you can start practicing yourself when you see things come across your social media feeds. Another thing, and Alana alluded to this one in her introduction, is that we have to read the articles that we see on social media. Here's an example. So Rhonda Rousey tweeted this article from NPR. She's a former MMA fighter. This idea from NPR that why doesn't America read anymore? And if you look at some of the comments and the replies, people are responding with their opinions about why people don't read anymore. And you can see some of them are very negative. But if you actually clicked on the link, you would see that it was originally posted as an April Fool's joke from NPR, highlighting the fact that people don't actually click on the links. It's actually a major problem. A study by Columbia University and the French National Research Institute a few years ago, they studied this phenomenon, and they actually found that 59% of links that are posted, people don't actually click on them. But more importantly, they actually will engage with them. They'll reply to it, they'll share it, they'll comment on it as if they had read the article. Let me show you this example from earlier this year to really illustrate this point. This news story was posted back in January about a state senator who had filed a bill to ban cell phones for everyone under the age of 21. Here's the same story posted by CNN. And you can see that it just tells that there's this proposed ban. And if you look at some of the comments, people are commenting on, again, they're having these strong emotional reactions. They're angry about it. Some of them are supportive of it. But the example on the right actually provides more important context, that had you clicked on the article and read it, you would discover that the lawmaker actually never had any intention of passing it. He filed the bill as a protest statement because he was trying to draw attention to some of what he claimed were Vermont's overly restrictive gun control laws and proposed legislation. He even said himself he would never vote for it, and he knew it wouldn't pass. But if you had not clicked on those other articles, you wouldn't have learned that just from the headline and the lead. So I'm going to share a couple of our resources very quickly with you, some things that we have that you can also use. If you are an educator, our Checkology Virtual Classroom is our online learning platform for integrating news literacy into your curriculum. It is completely free for educators to use. We've had students as young as 5th grade and students even into colleges using this curriculum, and it teaches a wide range of news literacy topics. We have a flow chart that you can download. I'll give you a link in just a second. It's called How to Know What to Trust. It's basically a chart that walks you through some steps that you can follow. It takes less than 2 minutes to be able to figure out how to verify information and some important steps that you can take depending on the source of the information that you see. Here's this bit.ly link. I will share this with Alana so that she can send it out to everyone. And this is where you can download this PDF. And I'll also paste it in the chat when I'm done with my presentation here in a moment. On our website at newslit.org/coronavirus, we have updated information about misinformation relating to the pandemic and some resources and ideas for how you can be reliably informed with what's going on related to that. I mentioned our app, Informable. It is available for iPhones and Android devices. It is a completely free app and ad-free. It is a brain training style app that teaches several key modes where you can learn about the difference between news and opinion, if something has evidence or not, but also things like advertising disguised as something else. So this is an app that you can download on your phone, and you can go through it, and you can learn and practice some of these key skills. So that wraps up what my piece of this. If you are active on social media, here are our handles for various platforms. We do tweet a lot and share a lot of information on social media about misinformation and how to be reliably informed. And I'm really looking forward to answering some of your questions here in a few minutes.
Thank you so much, John. And thank you also for the very practical tools. Just a reminder that if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we will address them at the end of the program. The Holocaust Center maintains an extensive collection of artifacts from local Holocaust survivors and their families, objects with stories behind them reflecting the people of the time and informing our world today. I want to now introduce you to our museum educators and docents, Carl Shutoff and Marcy Bloom, to discuss propaganda during the Holocaust and some of the items from our collection. Carl, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Alana. I'm very excited to be able to participate today in the Lunch and Learn. Thank you. It's good to see everyone. we have a bunch of things to look at, so I'm going to get right into it. If you've been to our museum, it's very likely you've seen this poster before. And this poster first appeared, it was seen all across occupied Europe, but it was first seen in France, in Paris, at an international exposition called Le Juif et la France, the Jew in France. And that ran from September 1941 until January of 1942. Now, the exposition itself was sponsored by an organization called the Institute for the Study of Jewish Affairs, which is just a very long, pseudo-scientific, pseudo-intellectual way to say the Gestapo. Okay, the Gestapo essentially organized this thing. And the point of it all was to make sure that the world understood that they were, if they didn't act, if they didn't rise up, they would be at the mercy of the international Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy. So let's take a look at this poster. The symbolism is not subtle. This is not a subtle message here. The Jew, by the way, et derrière le Juif, the caption at the bottom means, and behind it all is the Jew. And the Jew that they're talking about is not an individual Jew. They're talking about what the Nazis referred to as der ewige Juden, the eternal Jew, the forever Jew, who was always trying to insinuate himself into the power structure. So what you have here, the Jew is standing literally behind and metaphorically behind the three flags, the British flag, the American flag, and the Soviet flag. And those flags are the flags of the Allies. So this is another way that they're sort of repeating the lie that the Jews were responsible for the war. They said that about World War I, and they said that about World War II. What I would also like to do, since I have just a couple minutes, I want to put this into a broader historical context. In the same way that Hitler did not invent anti-Semitism, there was anti-Semitism in France long before all this happened. There's a very long tradition of anti-Semitism in France. Very notably, and many of you are probably very aware of it, the Dreyfus affair, l'affaire Dreyfus, which took place in 1894. Dreyfus was an officer in the French army. He was Jewish, one of the few. He was accused of treason, accused of trying to sell secrets to embassy officials from the German embassy. He was found guilty, publicly humiliated, and sent to Devil's Island. And this incident essentially divided France down the middle. It became a cause célèbre for the liberals, for the freer thinkers, people like Émile Zola, who wrote a pamphlet called J'accuse, I Accuse, where he accuses the government of anti-Semitism and persecution. Sarah Bernhardt, the great actress, was also someone who rose up against this. And if we're going to now fast forward a little bit to what happened after the exposition, which ended in early 1942, this whole movement kind of culminated in July of 1942 with what became known as La Rafle, the Roundup, where thousands of foreign-born Jews were rounded up not by the Nazis, but by French police authorities. They were put into the Vélodrome d'hiver, the Veldiv, which is a very large, it's not there anymore, but it's a large cycling venue. And they were there for several days under the most horrific and horrendous conditions, at which point they were then sent to transit camps. Kids were separated from their parents. They were sent to transit camps, and from the transit camps, they went to Auschwitz. And as far as I understood, no children survived this particular roundup. So again, I just wanted to give you a broader sense of how French anti-Semitism fits into the larger picture. And while I was looking around, doing a little research for this, I at the risk of sounding pedantic, I remembered a quote that I would like to share with you. The quote is from a book by Kurt Vonnegut. Vonnegut wrote in the 50s, one of his earlier novels called Mother Night. And Mother Night was about an American who lived in Germany during the war, who was an agent for the Americans, a propagandist, and smuggled secrets to the Allies in little pauses and hesitations in his propaganda broadcasts. And it was his job to draw figures like this. And he says, and I quote, "I had hoped to be ludicrous, but this is a hard world to be ludicrous in, with so many human beings, so reluctant to laugh, so incapable of thought, so eager to believe and snarl and hate." So that is the 25 words or less version of anti-Semitism in France and the extent to which this poster fit into the larger picture. And with that, I'm going to, Marcy's going to take the ball and run a little further with. I'm going to turn this over to my good friend, colleague, partner in crime, Marcy Bloom.
Thank you so much, Carl, and thank you for sharing that information. Let's look at this slide. A little background. First of all, we cannot emphasize enough that the Nazi propaganda disease of dehumanization and othering was embedded in every aspect of German life. And this included an obsessive focus on children with the use of colorful and visually appealing picture books, as you see here, that were used to indoctrinate and frighten young women with the most extreme anti-Semitism imaginable. Just think about Dr. Seuss and think of the Dr. Seuss of hate. Julius Streicher, and Carl will talk more about him shortly, was the chief editor of the sensationalist anti-Semitic adult-focused tabloid newspaper called Der Stürmer. And that is often called history's most evil newspaper. And Streicher was also the creator and publisher of these various children's books. He declared, "We German educators wish to impart to our young people from childhood on the dreadful danger posed by the Jew." This image on the left, as you see, it's the English version, is one of the most infamous of Streicher's disgusting picture book creations for children, the 1928 book, Der Giftpilz. This simplistic image of the poisonous mushroom concocts a hateful story that compares Jews with poisonous mushrooms. The lesson to the children is that these bad, harmful mushrooms are difficult to distinguish from the good, edible, pure, safe ones, just as it is difficult, sometimes impossible, to differentiate poisonous Jews from the, quote, real Germans, unquote, because Jews can assume many deceptive forms. In the first story of the poisonous mushroom, the mother is telling this story to her dear son Franz and warns him of the terrible destructive force of the Jews. "One Jew," she says, "my dear boy. One Jew can destroy an entire people because the Jew is the devil in human form. And so, my dear Franz, it is Germany's obligation to understand, to learn, and warn the rest of the world about this terrible mushroom among us and save humanity from this evil." And this is only the first of one of the many emotionally manipulative stories in the poisonous mushroom, and John just talked about emotional manipulation. The book is organized into 17 stories with 3 main themes: the physical appearance, the religious beliefs, and the moral values of the Jews. In school, during the so-called Jewish lesson, German children are instructed to recognize and smell the ugly physical characteristics of Jews. Another chapter states that Jewish law, the Talmud, mandates Jews not to work in manual labor, but to lazily engage in business and trade, worship money like a god, and exploit the morally pure Germans as their slaves. Please look to the right. I'm sure you already have been examining that horrific image. As you can see from this grotesque drawing, young German children are portrayed as innocent and defenseless victims being lured by a frightening, ugly, and morally decadent caricature of a Jewish man giving them candy. All of the stories in The Poisonous Mushroom have a pornographic character that is evident from these child-oriented, colorful illustrations. The image of the eternal Jew as a criminal, as the inhuman boogeyman, the monster, an agent of the devil who victimizes and rapes helpless Germans, fueled the fears and nightmares of countless young children for years during the Nazi regime. Yes, this was mandatory education in Nazi Germany. Children have to be taught to hate, and they successfully were. And tragically, this book is still available online and in hard copy. A friend of mine found a copy in a rummage sale in upstate New York, was horrified, grabbed it so he could send it to me, and now it is in the Holocaust Center's collection. And now back to my good friend, Carl.
Let's see, I think we need, there we go. Okay, thank you, Marcy, thank you. So we're talking about propaganda, and when it comes to the Third Reich, we know that they did all they could, and in every possible venue, to control the flow of information to the outside world. Now, the poster that I showed you before, that was a sort of a bold-faced, in-your-face kind of way of conveying ideas about Jews and what their motivations were. What you see in front of you now are cards, and these cards were found in cigarette packs. The card on the right-hand side of your screen, on the upper card, that's the burning of the Reichstag. Okay, and each one of these cards would carry some sort of propaganda value. The burning of the Reichstag was a very significant event in the evolution of the Third Reich. Took place at the end of February in 1933. It was blamed on the communists. I believe a Dutch communist was accused of this. Most historians pretty much agree that the Nazis did this just so they could shift blame onto the communists. At this point, Hitler now had an excuse to go to Paul von Hindenburg, who was the president, and persuade him to suspend civil rights, which is exactly what happened. And it wasn't long after that before the Reichstag parliament had essentially relinquished all of its power to Hitler and his cabinet. So this particular card has tremendous propaganda value. The card below is a picture of Hitler right there, sort of a little off center, and to the right is Julius Streicher, who Marcy has already spoken to you about. Streicher was the editor of Der Stürmer, which was the Nazi newspaper. And he was, the Stürmer was so rabid, it was so over the top, that when the war was over, Streicher was captured. He was indicted for crimes against humanity and was executed pursuant to the International Nuremberg tribunals. So these are two cards with a tremendous propaganda value, and to make it even more insidious, those two cards, you would collect them. There'd be a big set, and you'd collect them. You'd show your loyalty to a certain brand of cigarettes, right? And you'd get these cards, and then you paste them in to this book, which is very much like what we did when we collected stamps as kids, or when we collected baseball cards or football cards. I do want to point out also that cigarette cards, the use of cigarette cards, the Nazis did not invent that. That was not their. They can't take credit for that. If you lived in England or France in the middle of the 19th century, you could buy cards, and inside those cards, you could buy cigarettes, and inside those packs of cigarettes there would be cards, and maybe they would be for advertising. Maybe they would be characters from a Dickens novel, or maybe they would be characters from a Shakespearean play. Cigarette cards were a genuine cultural artifact in the 19th century in Western Europe. So this is just another example of how the Nazis could take something and twist it and corrupt it for nefarious purposes. Now, I should mention also, there are two other cards in our collection. One of them is what was known as the Brown House, which was the Chancellery office in Munich. And another one was a rally, a Nuremberg rally. And as you know, there were many rallies in Nuremberg. The one in question here took place in I believe it was 1923, and it celebrated it was called a German Day rally, which celebrated the victory of the Germans over the French in a battle in the Franco-Prussian War. So, long story short. But this is, once again, a more indirect, a more insidious, a more playful way, if you will, of getting information out there that is not necessarily true, but points in a very particular slanted political direction. So with that, I'm going to send you back to Marcy now.
Thank you very much, Carl. Here's our next image. The red letter V stamped on the book on the right, you can see V there. This is a 1915 book in English. It's called King Frederick and the Grand Coalition. It's by Thomas Mann, and the V stands for verboten, forbidden, banned, prohibited. Although the works of the Jewish population, as we would imagine, were primarily the target of banned and later burned books in Nazi Germany, non-Jewish intellectuals, such as Thomas Mann, were also included in the Nazi Party's long list of authors whose books were considered threatening. Thousands of these books were burned in huge bonfires as a core aspect of massive rallies accompanied by fear-mongering propaganda speeches by Nazi leaders. So just who was Thomas Mann, and why were his books and ideas so feared by the Nazis? Well, this prolific writer was actually the 1929 winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature and is considered by many to be the greatest German novelist of the 20th century. In his 1930 speech, which he called An Appeal to Reason, which he delivered in Berlin, Thomas Mann bravely denounced Nazism. He pleaded to his fellow Germans for a united and powerful resistance against the rising, quote, human fanaticism, unquote, and called for the principles of democratic freedom in Germany. As you can imagine, he was subsequently stripped of his German citizenship That was in 1936. He came to this country in 1939. In 1944, became a citizen. In 1940, Thomas Mann began monthly anti-Nazi broadcasts in his native German via the BBC in England. He implored his fellow Germans, that was the target of these broadcasts, he implored them to oppose the ideology and the actions of the Nazi dictatorship. And he was always introduced as a writer, quote, whose books had been burned, unquote. Now let's look at that other image, the photo of a book burning. In 1933, Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister for popular enlightenment and propaganda, quite an interesting name, he began the chilling effort to bring all German arts and culture in line with Nazi goals and ideas. And in May of that same year, Nazi student groups carried out burnings of books throughout the country that they claimed were un-German, degenerate, and offensive to the German race, German culture, and German history. There were long blacklists of these works by international prominent figures. And these blacklisted and burned books even focused on American writers, Ernest Hemingway, Jack London, Helen Keller. They were viewed as, quote, corrupting foreign influences, unquote. And of course, as we would easily imagine, the achievements of renowned Jewish figures were the most despised, and included in these horrific fires were the books of two examples: Austrian Jewish founder of psychoanalysis, Dr. Sigmund Freud, and of course, German Jewish scientist and recipient of the 1921 Nobel Prize in Physics, the internationally renowned Dr. Albert Einstein. And among these important works burned in these propaganda-inspired book burnings were the writings of the German Jewish poet Heinrich Heine, who wrote in the 1820s, he wrote the famous admonition, where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people. If only Germany had listened to his warning. And now back to Carl.
Thank you, Marcy. And this is the last artifact that I'm going to be discussing with you. As you can see, it's a copy of Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf was Hitler's magnum opus. And the copy that we have in our museum is, it was an anniversary gift given to a couple by the mayor of Vienna. Please think about that for a second. What better way to celebrate a loving couple with 700 pages of lies, hatred, and racial invective. Mein Kampf was written in when Hitler was in Landsberg prison, and he was there for about 9 months. He was discharged in 1925. Long story short there, in 1923, Hitler tried to overthrow the government, what is famously called the Beer Hall Putsch. He did not succeed. He was accused of treason. He was tried, found guilty of treason, sentenced to 5 years in jail, and only served about 9 months. And when he was in prison, that's when he wrote Mein Kampf. And Mein Kampf, the key components of Nazism are there. You've got anti-Semitism, the notion of the master race, the notion of the Jewish communist Bolshevik conspiracy to take over the world, and also the idea of Lebensraum, which can be loosely translated as living space. Hitler was not only satisfied with taking over Western and Central Europe, he also had his eyes on the East as well. Hence the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941. So I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for Q&A. So I'm going to send it back to Alana. One more thing I want to mention here is that Mein Kampf, the copyright, excuse me, the copyright for Mein Kampf after Hitler's death was held by local authorities in Bavaria. In 2016, the copyright expired and Mein Kampf went into the public domain. And right now on Amazon, it is 4,739. That's where it is in the number of books being sold on Amazon. And you know how many books are being sold on Amazon, so that's kind of an impressive figure. It would please me to think that people are reading it for its historical value, but I also have the stinking feeling that there are people out there who are reading this because they are interested in the ideology. And with that, I thank you, and I'm going to give it back to Alana.
Thank you so much, Carl and Marcy. We have a lot of questions here. Most of them, John, are directed towards you, and maybe what I'll do is read out a few of them so that the rest of the folks listening can hear what the questions are, and then you can answer them. If that sounds good. Okay, so one of the first ones we received is, how can we fact check friends without making them defensive?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. So when someone you know shares something that you know is not true, that's misinformation, we say start by approach with caution. What you don't want to do is call them out, criticize them, try to make them feel foolish, because what you'll actually end up doing is triggering what's called the backfire effect. You know, we don't want to be proven wrong. No one likes that feeling. And if we feel sort of threatened or belittled, we tend to hold on to those a little bit more tightly. A good way of doing it is to think about questioning. So if someone shares a fake image and you verify that it's not real, one way you can do is you can sort of push it back in the form of a question. So you can ask, so where did you get that image from? I'm a little skeptical about that image. I found another version of this image here, and I'm going to share it to you. What do you think? The way you want to do it is to sort of show evidence of what's true in a way that invites them to evaluate it for themselves through empathy and questioning. But you also have to be willing to walk away if somebody is not open to it. You don't want it to be confrontational. But usually by sort of showing it to them and inviting them to look at it themselves and question it for themselves. That's usually a good approach.
Thank you. There's another question here from Dominic, and he says, I'm surprised you didn't mention Snopes.com. Any thoughts?
So Snopes is one of several major fact-checking organizations that are out there. I generally don't recommend one over another. But what I do encourage people is to look at the fact-checking sites as critically as you would any other source. A quality fact check is one that tells you what a claim is. They do make a determination, but then they show their work. They show you the evidence that they found for how they reached the determination. So they'll show you an original image or the actual factual information that they were able to verify. So think of it in terms of how you would evaluate, say, a news article or any other type of important information. You have to really look to make sure that they're not just telling you, they're showing you as well.
Now, this next question came up in several different formats, but it's essentially getting at the same question. And it is, how do you handle a news station such as that seems to only promote fake news?
Yes. So there are a lot of what seem to be news sites or blogs that are talking about current events. They're talking about the things that are happening, but they're not even pretending to be news. They're not even trying to tell us in a factual way, following the standards of quality journalism. Most of them are outlets of propaganda, and in many cases, outright misinformation and conspiracy theories. When you encounter those, when you see a pattern over time, you want to evaluate a source over time to make sure that it's not just overwhelmingly opinion. There can be news interspersed with some of these sources. And it's important as you look at it over time to realize what the pattern is. And if the pattern shows you that they pretty much only put out hyper-partisan propaganda, they publish misinformation, or even promote conspiracy theories, then you can feel comfortable ignoring them, pretty much entirely. But if we're talking about like a major news organization, so there's a lot of times people want to dismiss a major news outlet like CNN or MSNBC or Fox. That's where differentiating news and opinion becomes so important, because many of these organizations do have a very, very clear political leaning in their commentary and their opinion. But talking about bias when we're talking about those pieces is almost a pointless exercise, because opinion and commentary is supposed to be biased. That's why we want to look at a source over time, because you'll see that some organizations, they do put out news that follows the standards of quality journalism, and you have to evaluate that differently than you do opinion pieces.
Thank you. This is really a timely question and has been in the news quite a bit the last week. And it's asked by TB Nast. What is your view of media fact checkers, and related, of Twitter, Facebook, etc., deciding for what is true and what is not?
So the first part about media fact checkers, again, you want to make sure that they are trying to do fact checks in an objective way. They're showing their work. They're showing the evidence that they found for how they made the determination for that fact check. And if they are doing it objectively, then you can, as you're evaluating it, you can tend to trust them more. Really, it's about they have to earn your trust with those fact checks. And so you really have to feel comfortable that you're getting an objective fact check. When it comes to the social media platforms and fact checking, that's a really dicey issue, because there is a big debate about how much social media platforms should be involved in fact checking the content that people post. There's the controversy surrounding several tweets from the president and the official White House account that were flagged. Facebook has said that they will be doing hardly any of that. I think what I would really like to emphasize is that we can't place all of our hope that the platforms will resolve this issue. Misinformation is a massive problem. It is an epidemic in our information landscape. And really, there are some things that social media platforms can do to mitigate the misinformation that's shared. But the reality is that the more important solution is through education and teaching people about how to verify information and prioritize news from reputable sources of information that follow the standards of quality journalism. It's really more our responsibility to verify and prioritize that information for ourselves, and then maybe curate our social media feeds to filter out some of those more blatant sources. So yes, I think the social media platforms can and should do more, but the bigger priority, I think the more effective solution, is through education and talking about things like this, having this discussion that we're having today.
Thank you, John. And one last question, and I think this is a really good one to end on. This is from Janice, and the question reads, "This is so helpful. Can I show this to my students next year? Not sure if it is copyrighted. Thanks."
It is not copyrighted. We'd be happy to share this presentation with you. We have other resources. If you are an educator, please feel free to email me. I'll ask Alana to send it out to people who are registered, but it's jsilva, JSILVA, @news-lit.org. If you'd like to learn more about some of our education programs, you can email me directly or go to our website, and you can see many of the other resources that we have specifically for educators. One of them is also, we have some recordings from a recent news literacy webinar series that we had for educators. I'll also try to send that link out so that we can share it with you. But yeah, absolutely, please take whatever I shared with you today, and I would love to keep the conversation going with anyone who's an educator who's watching.
Great. Thank you, John. And of course, if you want to hear more from John, if you take a look at our website, you'll see that we have 2 programs scheduled, more extensive programs on this topic in October. It is yet to be seen if we will be having those in person or as virtual programs, but you can register for them now on our website. So please take a look for them there. And I want to truly thank you, John, for joining us today. Thank you, Carl and Marcy, for sharing all of your knowledge and passion with us on the artifacts. And we hope to hear more from both of you at a future time, or in the future, come visit us at the museum and you can meet both of them in person and hear a lot more stories about the incredible artifacts and objects that we have and the survivors that are profiled at the Holocaust Center. I want to take a moment now before we conclude the program to thank our incredible team at the Holocaust Center for Humanity that is working so hard to make programs like this one possible, including our virtual Speakers Bureau presentations, book discussion groups, teacher trainings, and timely and relevant teaching materials, and so much more. Our Executive Director, Dee Simon, Nicole Bella, our Director of Development, Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, Lori Worshel-Cohen with our Legacy Speakers Program, our education team, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrugge, Rosa Campos, Amanda Davis, our Senior Operations and Engagement Officer, and our development team, Sydney Draytel, Ellie Selesky, and Katie Lawrence, our Administration Coordinator. I hope you all will be able to join us next Tuesday at the same time for a very special program with local journalist and editor Knut Berger on Real Nazis of the Northwest from 1933 to 1941. Thank you all so much again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next week. And this concludes our program.